Thank you, Nikki John, for making time to have this conversation. One of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about is the issue of, given your expertise, the issue of media warfare, propaganda warfare. Obviously, different sides try to push their own narrative, and in pushing these narratives, they're using both conventional media and print media, newspapers, and TV, cable TV, satellite TV, but also social media, increasingly more Instagram, TikTok, and all of that. Um, can we start with these AI generated Lego videos from Iran that have gotten a lot of attention? Many of them have gone viral. What do you think of these videos? What do you make of them? Why do you think they're getting so much attention?
I'm so glad you started with that because I've been following them from the very beginning. And I think they are one of the many things about this war that has caught people by surprise, including myself. So, as you mentioned, the war of narratives has really long been, it's part of this war, but it's been a part of contemporary warfare for a while now. And it's gotten to the point where politicians and even people on the battlefield have recognized that you have your victories on the battlefield, and they're very, of course, important. They determine outcomes, but just as important are the narratives around them. And the it used to be called winning hearts and minds, but it sort of morphed into something else because of the media environment that we're in now. And I think one of the things that was surprising after the war started is the way that so I want to say I want to be careful in how I frame it because it's hard to say who these people are, right? Is it a state response? Are there individuals? Where's the money coming from? But just looking at the phenomena itself, looking at the Lego videos, looking at, let's say, all the Twitter accounts from the various Iranian embassies that are putting out very specific and frankly funny and clever content, it's been very surprising to audiences, again, including myself, because while I work on state media productions, I've long followed Iranian cultural productions that are either state endorsed or state funded. You can sort of recognize a kind of sloganeering or a kind of, you can see that sometimes there's a top-down message that's coming, but with these you can't. It's almost like, you know how they talk about this war as a decentralized, like asymmetric war on the ground? It almost seems like that's what's happening on the media side as well, including with these things like the Lego and the social media accounts. And I think the reason they're getting a popular following is precisely because of this, because they're not formulaic, they're not what you might expect, and whoever is behind them has a very, very deep and accurate knowledge of niche areas, about American culture, about
Because they do
American
them in
society.
different genres too. There's hip hop, there's rock, there's pop.
Exactly, yes. And the level of detail, like sometimes, they'll have like 10 seconds of something that happened in the American embassy in Iraq, and you'll see the little Lego figures are actually like the people who work in that embassy, and that, uh, I haven't done a sort of micro analysis of all the scenes, but it's very carefully crafted. And you can actually do a deep analysis of it. You can't really dismiss it as easily as you would a kind of formulaic propaganda piece. So I think that's part of the appeal. It's new, it's unexpected, and it speaks the language of like they know the audience, the American audience, in a way that traditionally the Iranian state has not been able to grasp the attention of Western or younger audiences. I mean, they haven't been able to grasp the attention of you know, their own people, much less broader audiences. So I think that that explains the appeal. And like you said, there's various music genres, there's a storyline, they do little trailers for them. So it gets people interested, and then they disseminate it in the right spaces online. And I see the people, the team, they engage with different accounts. So it's very lively and doesn't give you the sense that you're dealing with like a, old cleric, let's say.
Right, right. And I guess to that, I could have also added, because you mentioned the embassies and the tweets that go out. even the tweets from Qadi Buff, right?
Oh, right.
Which
Yeah.
are sort of, again, speak to specific issues that maybe the US voter is interested in and all of it. And they're not formulaic, as you said.
Yes, yeah. And one of the things I noticed, like, because that's a question we talk about it among friends and fellow academics, like, who is it? Who's behind these? There's not a single there, it's not the case. I doubt very much that there's a single person. Each embassy has one person. But it doesn't seem like the message is centralized either, because if you notice, they sort of mirror the language or the culture of where they're at. So the tweets from, like, South Africa are very different from the tweets from Japan, are very different from the tweets from Armenia.
Oh,
So
interesting.
there is something kind of complex going on there. And I think that's intriguing because it's not, 'cause you're just wondering, who are these people, where they come from, and where were they before?
Right, right. Okay, so that's one side of this media warfare, right? These the Lego videos and all of it coming from Iran. But then the other side of this media warfare, or the propaganda warfare, is the narrative from the opponents of the war, right? The people who support the war on Iran, people who normalize it or have normalized it for months or years, even prior to the war, people who present the war as being inevitable, or even as being something that, is supposed to liberate Iranian people from the evil regime and all of that, right? And of course, this is the kind of narrative that we have seen articulated, perpetuated, and disseminated by diasporic satellite channels like Iran International, like VOA, Manoto, even BBC Persian to some extent. What do you think of this? How do you assess these diasporic media outlets?
Well, I would say that, I mean, as you said, this has been a long process and it didn't start in the last year, but we can really, unfortunately, lay direct blame on many of them for um, sort of preparing manufacturing consents for the war. I have to say, because I think it's important to note this at the outset, because there is a reason why these outlets are able to capture the mass number of audience members that they are able to reach out to, and that's because of the lack of a free and open press inside Iran and the terrible state of Iranian state broadcasting for many, many years. I mean, from the outset, really, because state broadcasting, it's not just that it's a state narrative. It has historically, the Iranian broadcasting captured and presented the most sort of hardline extreme elements of the state. So you have to start there. Why are people turning to outlets like Iran International, to Voice of America, BBC? Because they don't have viable options, or had not until there's no mass media for them to turn to for credible information. So there's a sort of reactionary and understandable reason behind that. Now, that doesn't mean then, though, that we can exonerate all these diaspora media from their responsibility, from the way that they also engage in straight up propaganda and making the way for the war. And if you can trace some of the reasons that people echo in other spaces to specific channels. I mean, again, I think the most blameworthy is going to be Iran International, because it's the one, I mean, to some extent, Manotoa as well, but they don't even really have a veneer of professionalism the way that you might see, in BBC, for example. And so they present it to us. I mean, this is traceable. It's not just people making this up and making accusations. They presented narratives such as, well, this is the only choice. The US-Israeli coalition is going to only, what's the word they use? Like precision.
Precision
They only
strikes, targeted
Precision strike. It's only
assassinations.
going to
Yeah.
targeted assassinations. They're not going to, it's a very specific narrative that they presented. And what's really fascinating, I have to say, and it's actually driving me crazy right now, and I think it's important for us to know, is that all those things that people like us, that academics, that anti-war activists said would happen after the war. We said it's not gonna be an easy regime change. It's going to make hardline elements more hardline. It's going to bring more poverty. It's going to make political repression more. All those things that we said are happening, right?
Mhm.
And now you can see some of those pro-war groups list those things and then as though the anti-war people are to blame for it. Like, well, we told you this was going to happen. It's a very interesting sort of switch that they're doing now. And I even noticed people from Iran International. There was the person who's in charge of their digital was posted a post in English the other day that said, "Oh, American intelligence services said in February that these are the things that would happen if a war happened." The same things that we say, right? And it was just mind blowing to me because this is exactly the opposite narrative that they were presenting to people. So I think I don't want to go on too long, but you can actually, again, by tracing the messaging, see what an impact uh, places like Iran International had in convincing people. And I don't want to use the term brainwashing because I don't want to assume an audience doesn't is an unthinking audience. But you can see that some of like classic propaganda forms were used, such as repetition, and some of the ways that people's heartstrings were pulled on using information that was not verified. And so you present people with a situation where they think there's no other choice but war. And of course, you don't, it's almost as though these people present information in a vacuum because if they, for example, had covered non-Iran stuff in a fair way. So let's say if they had covered the genocide in Gaza, if they had covered anything that's going on in U.S. politics in a fair way, then maybe the audience would think twice about, well, asking Netanyahu or asking Trump to bomb Iran. But that the audience is not provided with that full information and is only given a very sanitized version of previous wars and the war that's to come. And it's amazing to me that even just in spite of what's happened after the war, they still have an audience. So I think that's work for people in other fields to try to figure out like how can you see reality and still hold on to the promise of the media of that particular media presented to you.
It's also been interesting to me that there's the narrative that they try to push, and in many ways they work as the sort of media extension of Israel or the US. And so they've been, as you said, through repetition, but also through exclusion. That's also been very
Yeah.
interesting to me. And even as you mentioned, BBC Persian, which has more of a veneer of professionalism, it's been kind of the way that certain narratives are excluded, certain voices are excluded, and certain narratives are constantly played as if this is the only authentic voice of the Iranian people, and the whole notion of the people want there to be bombardment, the
Yes.
people want to be liberated. Whereas prior to the war, and many of us had written about this, there were all these statements coming out after the June War, all
Yes.
these statements coming out from Iranian civil society organizations, from the Writers Guild, from Mothers for Peace, from workers' unions, saying, we have our deep grievances with the Islamic Republic, and we're going to continue to struggle for our rights no matter what. But we're also deeply against any imperialist intervention in our country. But you would rarely hear, almost seldom would hear any mentions to these old civil society networks that do actually represent a chunk of public opinion in Iran, any reference to them in the diasporic media.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there is mention, there's also campaign to discredit those people.
Yeah,
And so and that's unfortunately, that the sort of black and white notion that if you're against the war, then you're for the state. I mean,
sure.
as you mentioned, all these longstanding activists and groups have spoken out against this, and yet that it's like a drop in the ocean if they even mention it, but they don't. They don't mention it in even in fair ways. So I don't know, like in terms of what that means for us as academics, as sort of anti-war activists. I get asked this question sometimes, like if everything is against us, if they have the media, if they have the algorithm. I mean, as you know, big tech has been sort of manipulating the algorithm as well. So they have that, and the American press or the Western press, even if they're none of them are really anti-war, but even if they're anti-Trump, they still are not, they also come from this long-standing sort of, decades of anti-Iran framing. And so what can we do in this environment? It becomes really demoralizing if you think of it in those terms, but conversations like the ones that we're having, hopefully they will eventually sort of coalesce into something and at least, to push back against it. And
That's the
also,
hope, I think.
yes, sorry, and also to continue to name the outlets and the sources of the misinformation. There was a piece in the Financial Times just this week, I don't know if you saw, which did sort of uncovered the funding behind Iran International. They had something like $650 million of their debt forgiven, and that sort of transparency is really important. So for us to ask for transparency uh, in funding and tracing those uh, where the money is coming from often helps us find where the agenda is.
Before we wrap up, I know that one of your research interests is sports and politics. We're recording this conversation, I think, maybe less than 10 days away from the FIFA World Cup. I'm not going to ask you to predict the scores or anything like that. But can we talk about the geopolitics briefly of the World Cup and Iran's participation in it? I've heard you say in your previous interviews and lectures that the Iranian national team, both as a team and as individual players, they're often used as pawns, not only by the Iranian state, but also by other actors, including the Iranian diaspora. Can you say a few words about this?
Yes, sure. So, as you probably know, there was a whole boycott campaign against the Iranian team back when the Qatar games happened in 2022. And this was also pushed by Iran International, one of the main places that this happened. And so there were all these attempts to sort of, I mean, I call it like sort of campaigns to steal the joy of Iranian people, which is again very ironic because for years people have rightly criticized the Iranian government for preventing people from being joyful.
Right.
And now it's the opposite. Now, when we see joy coming from Iran, the opposition doesn't want us to, um, you know, spread that joy. So I think things now are a little bit different because of the war, of course, complicated by the fact that, hopefully the ceasefire holds. But if the ceasefire doesn't hold, it will be, I think, the first time in history when two warring, not, it won't be the first time in history that two warring teams are in like playing against each other or playing in the same country, but it'll be the first time that one of the warring countries hosts the World Cup while another one comes. This is information that a colleague told me. I didn't know it, and so that already makes it a very unique kind of situation. But assuming the ceasefire holds, you can already see how the issue has been politicized in other ways, with the US refusing, sort of slow walking their visas, refusing some of the accommodations that the host nation is supposed to make. For example, they're supposed to guarantee the safety of all the teams. So that is part of what makes this even more complicated. And of course, the Iranian team has its own problems. I just heard that they're the oldest team in history. It's very depressing. And, you can see that there's probably internal dynamics behind that. And so I always feel, thinking about the team as the people's team, as representing a nation, I feel bad for them because I feel that they're pawns and they're being used by various sides. And so the argument that I've tried to make is that we shouldn't, I mean, as soccer fans, as Iranians, we shouldn't concede them to let them be used, let them be used by the state, let them be used by the opposition. we should use it as an opportunity to for unity because that one of the issues within the diaspora and within Iran are these divisions that seem like we're unable to overcome them, but something like the national team, which historically has been unifying, even people who like are enemies from like rival teams will support the national team, right? So that's been my argument and my hope that people can come together. They can have their political differences, but not to the team is already in such bad shape because of all the problems they have. Like, don't put this on these young men. Some of them not so very young, but still in absolute terms, young men, maybe not young for the World Cup, but nonetheless, that would be my plea to my fellow academics and my fellow diasporan Iranians and Iranians all over the world.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nikki. I enjoyed this conversation. I hope we
Thank you for having
have a
me.
chance to have a longer conversation at some point in the
That
future.
would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.